The railway station buzzed with the usual hum of activity, a mix of hurried footsteps, distant announcements, and the quiet rustle of newspapers being flipped. Families, travelers, and commuters bustled about, each with their own reason for being there. It was supposed to be a normal day, a simple trip to the city for a family outing. But for us, it would become a nightmare we couldn't escape. I glanced down at my son, Michael, and offered him a reassuring smile, though my heart felt heavy. Michael wasn't like other children. Born with cerebral palsy, he had never known the freedom of running or jumping like most kids his age. His movements were slow, deliberate, and sometimes awkward, but his mind? His mind was sharp, a fire that burned bright despite the limitations his body imposed on him. I'd always admired his resilience, the way he faced the world with courage no matter how the world looked back at him. "Are you excited, buddy?" I asked, ruffling his hair as we stood near the platform, waiting for our train. His eyes lit up, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "Very. We're going to see the dinosaurs, right?" I chuckled, squeezing his hand. "That's right. Just like we talked about." The train arrived, its sleek form cutting through the fog of early morning mist. We boarded, finding a quiet seat near the window. Michael's excitement was palpable as he eagerly pressed his face against the glass, watching the world blur past. For a moment, everything felt right, simple, peaceful, just like any other family day out. But then, something shifted in the air. A strange tension crackled as we crossed paths with her. HOA Karen. She was standing at the far end of the platform when I first noticed her. There was something about the way she stood, rigid and still, her eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a sense of unease that followed her wherever she went. I had heard rumors, whispers about her temper, her quickness to judge, her history of misunderstandings that escalated far too quickly. But I brushed it off. She was just another stranger. Or so I thought. As we walked past her to find our seats, Michael stumbled slightly. His legs weren't always steady, but it wasn't unusual. The crowd around us hardly noticed. But then, I heard her voice. "Watch where you're going," she snapped, her tone sharp and cold. I stopped in my tracks, confused. "Excuse me?" She stared at Michael with a look of disdain, her eyes narrowing. "He looks like a thief. Why are you letting him walk around like that? What's wrong with you people?" My heart dropped into my stomach. The word stung, but it wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Cold, accusing, and entirely unjustified. Before I could react, before I could offer an explanation or defend my son, she moved swiftly toward her bag, the distinct sound of a gun being unholstered echoing through the station like a thunderclap. And then, everything went silent. The shock of the moment hit me like a wave. The world slowed, time stretching as I turned to see Michael's face, confusion, pain, and the flicker of fear crossing his features. His body trembled, not from the cold, but from the realization that this stranger had turned into something far more dangerous. As I reached for him, the sound of a gunshot rang out, shattering the stillness and sending us all into a spiral of chaos. In that split second, I knew my life, and Michael's, would never be the same again. Suspense element. From the beginning, the audience is introduced to HOA Karen's suspicious and judgmental demeanor. Her previous behavior, hinted at through whispers and rumors, adds an ominous undertone. The sudden and unexplained escalation in her actions makes it clear that there is something deeply wrong with her, setting the stage for the tragedy that is about to unfold. The train was late, and with every passing minute, I could feel the unease building inside me. It wasn't just the wait, it was something about today, something in the air, that felt off. I glanced down at Michael, who was eagerly peering out the window, his eyes wide with anticipation, but there was a quiet tension in his face too. His hands fidgeted nervously, a habit he had when he was uncertain. Despite his disability, he had always found comfort in routines, and today's deviation from the norm seemed to unsettle him. "Everything's going to be fine, buddy," I reassured him, resting my hand gently on his shoulder. He smiled up at me, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. "Are you sure, Mom? You're sure we'll get to see the dinosaurs today?" I chuckled softly, trying to mask the unease I felt. "Of course. We're going to have the best day. No one's going to stop us." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The station around us hummed with the sound of footsteps and murmured conversations, the occasional screech of a train's brakes cutting through the noise. Families, business people, and tourists drifted by, each lost in their own world, unaware of the dark encounter that was about to unfold. As the minutes dragged on, the crowd thickened. Michael shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between the people walking past. I could see him trying to make sense of the movements around him, his mind piecing together the world in his own, unique way. I knew he wasn't as comfortable in crowds as some of the other kids. He had a heightened sense of awareness of the people around him, often absorbing too much, making him more sensitive to any change in atmosphere. That's when I saw her again. HOA Karen. She was standing near the far end of the platform, talking loudly to someone on the phone, but I couldn't hear her words. What I could see, however, was the way she carried herself, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the crowd as if she was looking for someone. Something about her gaze felt invasive, like she was dissecting the people around her with some kind of judgmental curiosity. I tried not to stare, but it was impossible not to notice her. There was an air of tension around her, too much intensity for someone so unremarkable. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I didn't want to make Michael anxious. He was still a little too focused on the world beyond the window, his fingers tracing the contours of the glass, lost in thought. We didn't know it yet, but today, HOA Karen would become the catalyst for everything that would go wrong. The crowd around us was starting to settle into place, the trains starting to pull in, when suddenly, Michael's legs gave way. His right leg, still recovering from a minor surgery, buckled under him, and he stumbled slightly. It wasn't a big fall, but the sound of it echoed through the platform, and people turned to look. I caught him just in time before he hit the ground, but the moment of vulnerability hung in the air, making me feel exposed. I helped him straighten up, giving him a gentle nudge to reassure him. "Don't worry, buddy. You're doing great," I whispered. But as we tried to regain our composure, I noticed a shift. HOA Karen, who had been standing off to the side, was now staring at us, more specifically, staring at Michael. Her eyes narrowed as if she were scrutinizing him, her lips tightening in a thin line. She said something under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear, but too soft to make out. I instinctively pulled Michael closer to me, but the unease in the air thickened. It wasn't just her gaze that bothered me, it was the way she seemed to regard him. There was no sympathy, no concern, just a cold, judgmental look that made me feel like we were intruding on her space. I took a deep breath and tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. People were always staring, always whispering. It wasn't new. But then, her voice cut through the air again. "Isn't that just perfect?" she muttered, loud enough now for others to hear. A cripple, out in the middle of a busy station. You'd think people would know better. Her words stung, and for a moment, I froze. Did she just call my son a cripple? I looked at her, trying to make sense of her hostility, but she wasn't looking at me. No, her eyes were locked firmly on Michael. It took all my restraint not to react. My heart was pounding in my chest as I gripped Michael's hand tighter, trying to shield him from the venom in her words. "Is something wrong, ma'am?" I asked, my voice as calm as I could muster, hoping to defuse whatever strange issue she had with us. But HOA Karen's expression only hardened. "This isn't a place for people like him. He doesn't belong here. He's a danger to himself and others," she snapped, her tone dripping with disdain. My blood boiled. The audacity, the cruelty, how dare she speak to my son that way? My hand trembled as I fought to keep my composure. I could feel Michael's unease rising, his confusion mirrored in his wide, searching eyes. "Excuse me," I began, my voice shaking now, "but you have no right to speak to us like that." "My son," but she cut me off, raising a hand as if to dismiss me. "People like him don't belong in public spaces, especially not near my family." "He could be a threat," she said, her voice dripping with venom. Something in her tone, her words, it all felt so wrong. She didn't know Michael. She didn't know us. And yet, she was painting him with the broadest of brushes, reducing him to a stereotype, a danger. I saw the brief flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something darker, something more dangerous. I glanced at Michael, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and hurt. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to be treated like this. But before I could say anything more, HOA Karen took a step closer, her eyes still fixed on my son, her fingers twitching at her side. The silence between us stretched longer, thicker, and more suffocating. It was as though the entire platform had come to a standstill. I had no idea what was happening inside her mind, but the situation was escalating far too quickly. I could feel it, the tightness in the air, the growing tension, the sense that something was about to snap. And then, I saw it. Her hand. She was reaching for something. Something that made my blood run cold. It was too late to stop her. Suspense element, as HOA Karen's suspicions grow, her words escalate from simple judgment to outright accusation. The emotional tension between the family members is palpable, especially Michael, who is caught in the crossfire of an adult conflict he doesn't understand. The escalating confrontation and HOA Karen's increasingly aggressive stance heighten the sense that this situation will soon spiral out of control, setting the stage for the shocking moment of violence to come. The platform, once alive with the sounds of commuters, felt as though it had frozen in time. I could hear the distant hum of trains pulling in, but it seemed muffled, like we were in a bubble, cut off from the world. The air between HOA Karen and us grew heavy with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Michael, still grasping my hand, shifted uneasily, but I couldn't pull my eyes away from the woman standing before us. She was still standing there, staring at us with that cold, unwavering gaze. Her body language had shifted, no longer just an irritated woman, she now seemed calculating. Dangerous. My instincts screamed at me to move, to take Michael and leave, but we were rooted in place, trapped in the moment. And then, her voice broke the silence again, sharp and full of venom. "You should be ashamed," she hissed, her words aimed directly at me. "Letting him roam around like this. He doesn't belong here, he's a menace. You should have known better." The words hit me like a slap, but the growing fire in her voice only made my body tighten with unease. I could feel the blood rushing to my head. I wanted to yell back, to tear into her for her cruelty, but I couldn't. I was too focused on Michael, on making sure he wasn't going to get caught in this woman's madness. Her words continued to pour out, each one more demeaning than the last. "He's a thief, isn't he? That's why you're trying to hide him, keep him out of sight, away from people." She took a step toward Michael, and my stomach dropped. "Stay away from him," I said, my voice trembling. My body surged with protective instinct, pushing Michael behind me as I stood tall. "You don't know him. You don't know anything about us." But HOA Karen wasn't listening. She wasn't interested in my words or my defense. Her attention was fixed on Michael, her eyes narrowing as she zeroed in on him. It was as if she had already decided who he was and what he was capable of, even though all he had done was stand there, innocently, a confused look on his face. "You're wrong," I managed, trying to hold back the fury that was building inside me. "He's just a child." "He's not." Before I could finish, she made a sudden, sharp movement. It was too fast for me to react to, too quick. I saw the flash of metal in her hand, just for a second, and then, before I could understand what was happening, she pulled the weapon out and aimed it directly at us. My breath caught in my throat. Everything around me seemed to slow, like time was dragging its feet, but my heart raced at double speed. It wasn't real, it couldn't be. But there it was, a gun, aimed straight at my son. No! I shouted, stepping in front of Michael, my body instinctively moving to shield him. But my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't get to him in time. The next few moments felt like a dream, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The sound was deafening. A single, sharp crack that shattered the silence. My ears rang, and for a brief moment, I thought it was my own heartbeat, pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. But no. It wasn't my heartbeat. It was the sound of a bullet ripping through the air. Michael's scream pierced the air, high and terrified, as he fell backward. His body crumpled to the ground in slow motion, as though the world itself had come to a halt. No! I screamed, my voice breaking as I rushed toward him. I knelt down beside him, my hands shaking as I pulled him into my arms, feeling the warmth of blood soaking through his shirt. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Michael, baby, no, please," I whispered frantically, tears streaming down my face as I held him close. His body was trembling, and I could feel the life slipping out of him with each labored breath. His hand grasped mine weakly, the touch so faint it almost felt like a ghost. What happened?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I could barely speak. My mind was spinning, overwhelmed by the surrealism of the moment. How had this happened? How had a normal trip to the station turned into this horror? How had a complete stranger, someone who had no reason to attack us, taken the life of my son in an instant? Behind us, the sound of running footsteps reached my ears. Shouts echoed from all directions as people began to realize what had just occurred. But all I could focus on was Michael. His labored breathing. His trembling body. "Stay with me, buddy. Just stay with me," I begged, my voice desperate. "Please, don't leave me. Don't leave us." I glanced up, my eyes locking onto HOA Karen, who was standing a few feet away, still holding the gun. Her face was impassive, emotionless. The weapon was aimed at the ground now, but she made no move to put it away. The entire station was in chaos, people running, shouting, pulling out their phones to record the scene, others yelling at her to drop the weapon. But all I could hear, all I could see, was Michael's pale face, his body barely moving as his breaths became more shallow. "Why?" I whispered through clenched teeth. "Why would you do this?" Her eyes met mine, cold, calculating. "I thought he was a thief," she said, her voice flat and detached. "I thought he was going to hurt someone. People like him, they don't belong here. They don't belong in the world." Her words were like ice, freezing me to the spot. She truly believed she had done the right thing. She believed the lie she had told herself. But it wasn't a lie. It was something much darker. Something more twisted. She had just murdered my son, and all she had to offer in return was a warped justification. The shouting grew louder as the police arrived, surrounding the scene, but none of that mattered to me now. Nothing mattered except Michael, who was slipping away from me with every passing second. The world around me blurred into a haze, the voices and commotion fading into a distant echo. All I could hear was the soft, terrified whimper of my son, the sound of his blood staining my hands, and the crushing weight of helplessness settling in my chest. The chaos continued to unfold as the officers subdued HOA Karen and took her into custody, but I couldn't tear myself away from Michael. The pain, the helplessness, the sheer devastation, it was suffocating. I looked down at my son, his eyes dimming, his grip on my hand weakening. And in that moment, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Suspense element: the moment of the shooting is sharp, emotional, and visceral. The audience feels the shock and disbelief of the family, the overwhelming fear of the situation, and the raw, immediate aftermath of the violence. The sudden escalation of the conflict, HOA Karen's complete disregard for human life, and the tragic consequence for Michael all worked together to create a deeply emotional, heart-wrenching moment. The suspense lies in the unpredictable nature of the event, how quickly a routine day turned into a nightmare, and the emotional fallout that follows. The first few moments after the shooting were a blur, a disorienting whirlwind of chaos and confusion. I couldn't fully comprehend what had just happened. The sharp, echoing crack of the gunshot still rang in my ears, a sound I would never forget as long as I lived. I could still feel the warmth of Michael's blood seeping through my hands, and it was as if the world had suddenly lost all meaning, as though I were frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think, unable to breathe. Michael's fragile body lay cradled in my arms, his face pale and cold, but still so full of innocence. His eyes were wide with fear, the confusion on his face evident, as if he couldn't understand what had happened, why he was in pain, why his world had shattered. The pain that surged through me was unbearable. I had promised him that everything would be okay, that today would be an ordinary day. But instead, it was the day everything changed. "Mom, it hurts," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible, a strained gasp that made my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. "I know, sweetheart," I said, my voice trembling as I tried to keep it steady. I didn't know how to comfort him, didn't know what to do. The pressure of his blood pouring out of him was overwhelming. "Stay with me, please. Please, Michael, hold on." I could feel his small body trembling, each breath shallow and ragged. His face was twisted in pain, and the blood that stained my hands seemed like a physical manifestation of my own helplessness. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but I could hardly form a coherent thought. Everything was happening so fast. Too fast. Around us, the station had descended into utter chaos. People were shouting, running, some pulling out their phones to record, others calling the police. A few people had come closer, but none of them dared to approach HOA Karen, who stood still, almost frozen in place, her hands still clutched around the weapon she had used to shoot my son. She was in a daze, her face devoid of emotion, her expression disturbingly calm for someone who had just committed such an unthinkable act. I barely registered the police and paramedics arriving, their rushed footsteps cutting through the panic of the crowd. But even as they rushed to my side, all I could think of was Michael, his fragile form clinging to life in my arms. The paramedics worked quickly, trying to stabilize him, but the minutes felt like hours, each second stretching out endlessly. "Ma'am, we need to move him. We need to get him to the hospital immediately," one of the paramedics said urgently, his voice cutting through the fog of panic that had settled over me. "No!" I nearly shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "Not yet. I can't leave him. I can't," but the paramedic was firm. "He's bleeding too heavily. We need to act now if we're going to save him." I nodded numbly, feeling a deep, instinctive pain at the thought of letting him go, even for a moment. They carefully placed him onto the stretcher, and as they wheeled him away, I couldn't help but feel like I was losing him, piece by piece, with each movement. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and shaking as if they could no longer hold me. My hands were still coated in Michael's blood, and I could feel the hot, sickening weight of it. I couldn't look away from the smear of red on my palms. My mind was clouded with thoughts, questions, a million different things, none of which made sense. How could this happen? Why was this happening? How could she have done this? The paramedics were gone now, the flashing lights of the ambulance fading into the distance as they rushed Michael to the hospital. My body felt numb, disconnected from the reality around me. I could hear the voices of the police, the officers speaking to witnesses, but their words were distant, like I was underwater. The station was still crowded, but none of it mattered. The world around me had crumbled, and all I cared about was my son. I didn't know how long I stood there, lost in a sea of grief and disbelief. I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't bring myself to do anything but stand there, staring at the spot where Michael had fallen. My body felt heavy, weighed down by an unbearable sorrow. The anger, the grief, it all bubbled up inside me, a storm threatening to drown me. Then, I saw her. HOA Karen. She was still there, standing like a ghost, her expression unreadable. The officers had surrounded her, and she had been handcuffed, but she didn't seem to care. She was staring at the ground, detached, as if what had happened wasn't real, as if my son's life, his pain, his suffering, meant nothing. The horror of what she had done was reflected in her eyes, but there was no remorse. There was no regret. She was unrepentant, and that made the entire situation feel even worse. I wanted to scream at her, to tear her apart with my words, to make her feel the pain I was feeling, but I couldn't. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed, my fists clenched at my sides. How could you? I finally managed to croak, my voice hoarse with emotion. She didn't even look up, and that was the worst part. She didn't care. The police came over, trying to shield me from further contact with her, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. I wanted justice. I wanted her to pay for what she had done. But what hurt more than anything was the silence that followed. There was no apology. No explanation. Nothing that could ever make this right. The hours that followed were a blur. I found myself in the sterile, cold waiting room of the hospital, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my heart racing as I stared at the clock. Every second felt like a lifetime. I could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above me, the low murmur of the staff walking past, but none of it mattered. I was lost in the void of my thoughts, my eyes fixed on the door that led to the emergency room. The door that could either bring me the news I dreaded or the news I prayed for. I didn't know how much time had passed when a doctor finally came out to speak to me. He was a tall man, his face drawn with a seriousness I didn't want to read into. "Are you Mrs. Last name?" he asked, his tone soft but professional. I nodded, my throat tight. "I'm afraid your son's condition is critical," he began, and I felt my stomach drop. "He's lost a significant amount of blood, and we've stabilized him for now. But the bullet did significant damage to his organs, and we're doing everything we can. He's still in danger." I closed my eyes for a moment, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over. Every word from the doctor felt like a punch to my gut. The reality of what had happened was crashing down on me, and I could barely hold it together. I wanted to ask questions, about how long he would be in surgery, whether he would survive, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself standing there, my hands clenched together, desperate for answers, for a miracle. The emotional fallout from that moment was beyond anything I could have ever imagined. The grief was a constant weight on my chest, suffocating me with each passing minute. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to losing Michael, how close I still was. The pain was overwhelming, raw, and constant. And as the days stretched on, as we waited for any news, one thing became clear: this wasn't just about the physical wounds Michael had sustained. It was about the emotional scars, the trauma he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The question of whether he would recover, not just physically, but emotionally, hung over us like a dark cloud. I could see it in his eyes whenever he was awake. The fear, the confusion, the sense that he was no longer the same person he had been before the shooting. The bullet had not just pierced his body, it had wounded his soul. But we would fight. We would fight for him, for his future, and for justice. Even if it meant facing the darkness of that day for the rest of our lives. We would fight, because that's what we had to do. For Michael. For our family. And for every other person who had been hurt by hate and fear. The days following the shooting were a blur of hospital visits, unanswered questions, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Every moment was filled with the weight of uncertainty, as Michael's life hung in the balance. But as his condition stabilized, a new urgency filled my chest, one that had nothing to do with the medical equipment and the doctors working tirelessly to save him. I knew we had to find justice. HOA Karen had to be held accountable for what she had done. But that was easier said than done. The police had arrested her quickly after the shooting. She was in custody, but even then, the investigation seemed to drag on at a pace that was maddening. The hours turned into days, and still, there was no clear answer about how she could have pulled the trigger, how she could have shot my son in cold blood and justified it to herself so easily. In the early stages of the investigation, the detectives assigned to our case seemed competent, but something in the air felt off. It wasn't just the overwhelming pain I was carrying, there was a palpable sense of resistance in the way the investigation was unfolding. The more I spoke with the officers, the more it became clear that there were hurdles we would have to face, obstacles placed in our path by things that had nothing to do with Michael's shooting and everything to do with who HOA Karen was. The first complication came when we learned that HOA Karen had a reputation in the community, one that wasn't exactly the most flattering. As it turned out, she wasn't just a random woman who had snapped in a moment of anger. No, she had a history. A history of complaints, accusations, and a pattern of behavior that suggested something far darker than a random act of violence. She's been involved in disputes with neighbors for years, Detective Hayes told me one evening, after what seemed like an eternity of questioning. Multiple complaints, some involving harassment. But nothing serious, just nuisance calls, the occasional fight. We've never had anything concrete. My stomach dropped. How could someone with such a track record be allowed to walk around with a weapon? How had no one stopped her before this? I felt sick thinking about it. The possibility that she had been allowed to get away with so much for so long gnawed at me. But the complications didn't end there. As I sat with Detective Hayes one evening, a phone call came through that sent chills down my spine. It was from a local news station. "Ma'am, we've just received a statement from HOA Karen's lawyer," the voice on the other end said. "She claims she acted in self-defense. According to her, your son was reaching into his bag, looking suspicious, and she feared for her life." I could barely process the words. Self-defense? How could she possibly claim that? Michael had done nothing wrong, nothing to provoke her. "She's lying," I muttered, my voice thick with disbelief. He was just standing there. He was scared of her. How could she make up such a thing? But the reality hit me, self-defense. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. The media, the public opinion, and even the legal system were starting to turn in her favor. My stomach churned as I realized that this was going to be harder than I had ever imagined. The days after the news broke were filled with public debates, social media outbursts, and the emergence of a new narrative. HOA Karen's lawyer, a well-known figure in the area, had begun to spin her version of the story. A version where she was the victim, where Michael's disability and appearance were twisted into something threatening, something dangerous. They painted him as a threat, a suspicious character, someone who was out of place, someone who could have harmed her. The public reaction was split. Some rallied behind HOA Karen, praising her for protecting herself, while others, like my family and friends, saw through her lies. The community that had once felt like home now felt alien, divided between those who believed in her story and those who saw it for what it truly was, an excuse to justify violence. The investigation was no longer just about finding out what happened. It had become a battle. A battle not just for Michael's life, but for his legacy. For his dignity. For our family's right to grieve without facing accusations, without facing the twisted narrative that HOA Karen and her supporters were trying to craft. I had to take action. I reached out to an attorney who had experience with cases like ours, cases involving self-defense claims and racial profiling. From the moment I met him, I knew he would be an ally in this fight. "We'll need to gather everything we can. The physical evidence, the witness statements, and we'll have to bring in expert testimony about your son's disability and his state of mind," he explained. "But we have a strong case. We just need to make sure we're not drowned out by the media circus she's creating." But even with the new legal help, the obstacles kept coming. First, there were the biased witnesses, people who claimed they had seen Michael acting suspiciously on the platform, but whose testimonies fell apart under questioning. Still, the damage had been done. The idea that my son was somehow a threat to HOA Karen's safety had already started to stick. It was a subtle narrative, one that could easily be twisted and believed by the public. Then, there were the small-town politics. HOA Karen's lawyer had deep connections with several local officials, connections that started to become more apparent as the investigation progressed. There were reports of cases being dropped, of missing evidence, and, worst of all, whispers of deals being made behind closed doors. People in power seemed more interested in protecting one of their own than in seeking justice for Michael. It felt like we were fighting not just against HOA Karen, but against an entire system that seemed determined to look the other way. One night, as I sat in the hospital waiting room, trying to catch my breath after yet another exhausting day of legal meetings and police interviews, a call came through that changed everything. It was Detective Hayes. "We've found something," she said, her voice more urgent than usual. "There's a witness, someone who saw everything from the beginning. They're willing to testify." I felt a flicker of hope, but it was fleeting. What do they have to say? HOA Karen was not acting in self-defense. The witness saw her walk up to Michael. They saw her raise the gun first, before anything even happened. My heart leaped in my chest. Could this be the breakthrough we had been waiting for? Who's the witness? Where are they? Someone from the station. A security guard who had been watching the cameras. He didn't come forward until now because he was afraid of retaliation. But now, he's willing to speak out. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Relief? Fear? The flood of emotions was overwhelming, but one thing was certain: this was our chance. The weeks that followed were a blur of courtroom drama and mounting pressure. The media frenzy intensified as the trial began, with every single detail being picked apart in front of the public. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that HOA Karen had lied, had manipulated the situation to fit her own narrative. And then, during the trial, the witness testified. He described in painful detail what he had seen: HOA Karen's cold demeanor, the way she had aimed the gun at Michael without any provocation, her words full of venom as she had justified her actions in her own mind. The jury listened in silence, and for the first time since the shooting, I felt a sense of hope. The twist, the unexpected piece of evidence we had been waiting for, had finally surfaced. The trial lasted for weeks, but in the end, justice prevailed. HOA Karen was found guilty of aggravated assault, and although it wasn't the murder charge I had hoped for, it was something. It was justice for Michael. It was justice for the injustice she had inflicted on him. As she was led away in handcuffs, I watched her face, still impassive, still cold. But for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of her indifference. I felt lighter. As if, despite everything, we had finally begun to heal. The investigation, the twists, and the betrayals had taken their toll. But through it all, we had fought for Michael. We had fought for what was right. And in the end, we had come out victorious, proving that even in the face of such darkness, there could be light. The court case that had started with so much tension, so much uncertainty, finally reached its conclusion. It had been a grueling process, weeks of hearings, hours of cross-examinations, and countless emotional moments that wore us down to the bone. Michael, my son, had already endured more than anyone should ever have to, and we, his family, were emotionally drained, holding on to the sliver of hope that, somehow, justice would prevail. As the final day of the trial approached, I could hardly contain the mix of emotions coursing through me. Part of me felt numb, detached from the reality that I was in a courtroom fighting for my son's life, his dignity. The other part of me burned with anger, and the desire to see HOA Karen held accountable for her actions that had ripped our family apart. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. I could hear the soft shuffle of papers, the muted whispers from the crowd, the slow hum of nervous energy as the entire room waited for the moment of truth. For so long, I had tried to block out the pain of that day at the station, the sound of the gunshot, Michael's terrified scream, the blood on my hands. But now, as the verdict loomed, I felt it all again, the weight of that moment pressing down on me, squeezing the breath out of me. The jury had deliberated for hours, their final decision hanging over us like a storm cloud. The evidence was overwhelming. HOA Karen's own lawyer had failed to provide any credible justification for her actions. The witness who had come forward had painted a damning picture, and the media, despite their attempts to paint her as a victim, had slowly begun to turn their attention toward the truth. But despite all of this, I couldn't shake the feeling of doubt. What if the system failed us? What if, in the end, HOA Karen was allowed to walk free, allowed to escape the consequences of what she had done to Michael? When the judge finally spoke, his words shattered the fragile silence in the room. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, the court finds the defendant, HOA Karen, guilty of aggravated assault with a weapon. The court further determines that her actions were without justifiable cause, and that she intentionally caused harm to the victim, Michael, last name. I felt the breath rush out of my lungs, the relief overwhelming me. The weight I had carried for so long, the uncertainty, the grief, the anger, began to lift, just a little. This was justice. This was what we had fought for, what Michael had deserved all along. The courtroom erupted in muted applause from our supporters, but for me, it was a strange, hollow feeling. It wasn't the victory I had imagined. It wasn't the kind of closure I had hoped for. Even as I saw the security guards move to take HOA Karen into custody, I couldn't shake the thought that nothing would ever truly heal from what she had done. The next few days were a whirlwind of paperwork, court filings, and attempts to get back to some semblance of normal life. But Michael, though physically healing, had changed in ways I hadn't fully expected. The trauma of what he had endured, both from the shooting and the subsequent public trial, had etched itself deep into him. He had started therapy, and his doctors had assured us that his recovery would take time, both physically and emotionally. I remember the first time he spoke about the shooting after the trial. We were sitting together in the park, watching the ducks swim across the pond. It was a peaceful moment, and for the first time in weeks, Michael looked like he was at ease. He turned to me, his eyes still carrying the weight of what had happened, but a quiet strength now settling in them. "I remember it," he said softly, his voice hesitant. "I remember her looking at me, and it scared me. But I don't want to be scared anymore." I didn't know how to respond. The pain of what had happened was still fresh, still so raw. But hearing him speak those words, hearing him express his desire to move forward, was like a small flicker of light in the darkness. "I'm so proud of you," I whispered, my voice cracking as I wrapped my arms around him. "You're so strong, Michael." He nodded slowly, resting his head on my shoulder. "I know, Mom. I know I'll get through this. We'll both get through this." Despite the legal victory, the emotional toll of everything we had been through lingered. The scars of what HOA Karen had done were not just physical, they were emotional, mental, and spiritual. Michael's spirit had been broken that day, but slowly, piece by piece, he was rebuilding it. We were rebuilding it together. But what had really been taken from us? What kind of justice could there ever be for the trauma, the fear, the loss we had endured? We would never be the same, and that was something I had to come to terms with. The loss of innocence, the loss of security, was something that couldn't be erased by a guilty verdict or a prison sentence. In the quiet moments, when the world was still, I would replay the images in my mind, Michael in my arms, the blood, the pain, the fear. I wondered how much of it was still with him. How much of it was still inside me. We had survived the worst, but would we ever truly heal? The final chapter of the trial had closed, but our story was far from over. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. Justice had been served, yes, but it was a hollow victory. HOA Karen's punishment was a consequence of her actions, but it could never bring back what we had lost, what had been irrevocably changed. Michael and I, and the rest of our family, would carry the weight of that day for the rest of our lives. But there was something else now too, a kind of quiet determination, a resolve to keep moving forward, no matter what. Michael had survived. I had survived. And together, we would continue to fight for each other. In the days and weeks that followed the trial, I found solace in the little things, the moments where I saw Michael smile again, the times when we laughed together without the shadow of the shooting hanging over us. Slowly, as time passed, we began to reclaim our lives. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But we were moving forward, day by day. And as for HOA Karen, her time in prison would be her own punishment, and in some strange way, that was all the justice we would ever need. We had our lives back. We had each other. That, in the end, was enough. The journey we've been through has changed us in ways I never thought possible. From the moment Michael was shot, our lives became a series of moments I couldn't have predicted: fear, anger, grief, and an overwhelming desire for justice. Through all the chaos, the public trials, and the emotional battles, one thing has become undeniably clear: we can't let hate go unchallenged. Michael's strength, despite everything he's been through, has been the most powerful lesson of all. He's shown us that, even in the face of unspeakable adversity, there is room for hope, for resilience, and for healing. It's not a perfect journey, he's not the same person he was before that fateful day, but he is stronger. We are stronger. And that strength has allowed us to move forward, together. We've learned that the fight for justice doesn't stop with a verdict, it doesn't end with a sentence. The fight for justice is about continuing to raise our voices for those who cannot speak, for those who are silenced by fear, prejudice, or violence. The fight for justice is about creating a world where no one, like Michael, has to fear being judged or harmed because of their differences. Today, I ask you, as you hear our story, to reflect on what you can do to be a part of that change. It starts with standing up, with speaking out against injustice in all its forms, whether it's racial profiling, ableism, or any other kind of discrimination. It starts with showing kindness, compassion, and respect, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. If you're a witness to an injustice, speak up. If you see someone being treated unfairly, intervene. And if you're in a position of power, use that power to help others find their voice. Let's take a stand together, for victims of violence, for the oppressed, for the marginalized. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can ensure that stories like ours don't fade into the shadows, but become the spark that ignites change. The battle for justice isn't over. It's just beginning. And we need you to be part of it. End note. Reflect on the emotional weight of the story, and remember, every voice matters in the fight for justice.